This one regulation change impacted Formula One forever. The FIA is revving up for a major overhaul, and it's set to be a turbulent, high-speed ride. The Formula One governing body recently revealed explicit details about the technical regulations for 2026, and it promises to make things a lot different. But this is not the first time the FIA has shaken things up. In this video, we'll be taking a trip down memory lane to check out some of the regulations that really shook things up. You should stick around for this one. Chapter 1. Why the FIA keep changing rules. Before going into details about the regulation changes that have impacted the grid greatly, let's discuss why rule changes are so frequent in the first place. The major reason behind FIA rule changes is not so far-fetched. It all has to do with safety. Every year, the FIA searches for ways to improve the safety of the drivers and the spectators. Yes, spectators can be victims of F1 accidents, and there have been several accidents where spectators have lost their lives.
And a big fire there as they exited out of turn 3, and that looks very nasty indeed, and unsurprisingly, that is a red flag.
So there's a constant process to improve safety. And more times than often, implementing new safety regulations means altering the rules. Over the years, the FIA has reduced the speed of vehicles, enforced the introduction of safety equipment, and eliminated several dangerous practices from the speed. However, besides safety concerns, the FIA also devises new rules to ensure competitiveness and a level of racing track. Imagine the F1 becoming a one-horse race, where one team keeps crossing the finish line before others make it out of the pit lane. Races would become predictable, the fans would be bored, and drivers would lose their passion. Surely the FIA wouldn't want that, so they shake things up constantly by introducing budget cuts and rule changes to keep the track competitive. Many fans might be familiar with what happened when Mercedes dominated the grid from 2014 to 2020, winning both the Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship titles. Although races were competitive and it was difficult to predict who would win, the FIA wasn't too pleased with Mercedes' dominance and decided to act. They suddenly announced a new set of rule changes in the 2021 season that shifted the balance of power away from Mercedes. The FIA claimed the changes were for safety, but it was clear they wanted to end Mercedes' dominance. You'll understand more as we dive deeper, because we're just getting to the juicier bits. So, let's skip the early years and start our regulation change analysis from the 80s. Chapter 2. Dramatic rule changes in the 1980s and 90s. In the early 80s, Formula One became a lot safer due to the raft of safety regulations implemented during the late 70s and 80s. However, these safety improvements were not sufficient because they didn't address the danger of huge amounts of downforce created by the ground effect in the cars. Yes, it might have helped Mario Andretti dominate the grid in 1978, but it also led to the deaths of Patrick Depailler in 1980 and Gilles Villeneuve and Riccardo Paletti in 1982. Several other drivers had their careers brought to an end by heavy crashes caused by ground effect. So, the FIA decided to get rid of the ground effect. In its place, teams were ordered to run flat-bottom cars, which drastically reduced the amount of downforce being produced. Side skirts were also banned. These safety changes, coupled with the much stronger carbon fiber that replaced aluminum as the material of choice for building the cars, led to the track being rid of fatalities for the rest of the decade. However, the increase in power of the turbocharged engines in the vehicle threatened to undo all this progress. In 1980, Renault achieved success on the tracks by dominating almost every race using turbocharged engines. However, the power of the engine kept doubling, and in less than 10 years, its power output was in excess of 1,400 kilowatts. Initially, the FIA tried to rein in the power of the turbo engine by introducing some regulations in 1986, but it didn't work. So, in 1989, it was banned altogether. This meant Renault lost the feature that gave them dominance, and McLaren earned an opportunity to showcase what they were made of. Tough luck, Renault, but for the FIA, it was safety first. Fast forward to 1994, all driver aids were banned. Drivers like Alain Prost, a Williams driver at the time, had particularly enjoyed the benefits of driver aids. perfectly designed devices such as active suspension, traction control, and an ABS braking system in his Williams FW14C had given him an edge over his peers. But once the FIA caught a whiff of it, out the window it went, and all drivers had equal resources on the grid. Although there were rumors that Benetton provided Michael Schumacher with a hidden traction control system that helped him win his title run. But they swore it didn't exist. Who are we to question that? In 1998, the FIA made huge changes again. The regulations this time drastically changed the look of the cars. The cars were made to be 20 centimeters narrower, and grooved tires were launched. These changes were made to slow down the cars and reduce the grip levels. The FIA president at the time, Max Mosley, had explained that the simplest way to reduce grip was to reduce the size of the tire contact patch, and the easiest way to do that would be narrower tires. But if we decrease the maximum tire width, the straight line speeds would increase because a very high proportion of the aerodynamic drag of an F1 car comes from the wheels and tires. So for a smaller contact patch, we needed some form of tread. After the changes were made, the cars became slower by an average of 0.8 per lap at most circuits. While the changes in the 80s and 90s came with changes made specifically for safety reasons, in the 2000s, the FIA brought out the bigger guns. Chapter 3. The regulation changes of the 2000s. By the end of the 1990s, safety standards had improved considerably, and fatalities were almost non-existent. The few unfortunate incidents were not a result of poor safety measures. It was just proof that, like any other sport, it will never be completely safe. It was time for the FIA to shift their focus from safety to leveling the playing field. They soon noticed that some teams could afford to splurge on their cars, using only the best equipment. These teams' riches gave them an edge over competitors, and this did not thrill the FIA. Initially, the governing body didn't know the severity of the gap in finances until 2008, when Honda withdrew its participation at the end of the season, a time when the global recession had several teams rethinking their F1 chances. The Japanese manufacturer revealed that the world economic crisis was the reason behind their withdrawal, and they further shared they had sold the team to ensure it kept running. While the FIA was still trying to make adjustments to the regulations, Toyota and BMW also called it quits. With that, the FIA knew they had to make drastic changes. The governing body, alongside the remaining manufacturers, agreed that it was best to come up with rules that would reduce the cost of running an F1 team. However, nothing prepared the manufacturing teams for how far the FIA would go to keep the sport afloat. All aerodynamic devices, besides the front and rear wings, were banned. Slick tires were reintroduced. The race qualifying engines were limited to 8. The rear diffuser was made to be longer. Testing during the season was banned, and the KERS, kinetic energy recovering system, which allowed drivers to use a 61 kilowatt power boost for 6.6 seconds per lap, was introduced. These changes resulted in a complete overhaul, and to the shock of many, the Brawn team spawned from the ashes, whooping everyone's asses both at the drivers' and constructors' championships. Great story, right? The next is even more interesting. After the first decade of the new millennium, F1 had put a check on the cost escalation with the introduction of budget caps. However, the regulation changes that were made to make the show more exciting turned out to be a failure. So, the rule change of the 2010s was to right the wrong and also make the sport more sustainable to attract sponsors. This led to significant rule changes in 2014. The rule changes that year saw the introduction of the 1.8-liter V6 turbo hybrid engine, a new power unit that not only burnt through 60 kilograms less fuel per race, but also featured an advanced energy recovering system, ERS, which delivered 150 kilowatts of power that could be used for up to 30 seconds per lap. The look of the car also changed. Narrower front wings were introduced. The cars got larger side pods, and the rear wing was reduced. All great stuff, but wait till you hear what the rule change did for the Mercedes team. Mercedes had been off the grid for 55 years before returning in 2010. They had hoped to make a grand entrance, but that didn't happen. And then, in 2014, they got the opportunity to shine. The engineering team had been able to design the perfect turbo hybrid engine. And for the next 7 seasons, Mercedes was at the forefront, dominating almost every race. Despite efforts by the FIA to shake things up and level the playing field in 2017 by introducing regulations that made cars wider and reduced lap times by 4 to 5 seconds, the power generated by Mercedes' turbo hybrid engine kept them at the forefront. The new rules could only reduce the margin of advantage. Then, in 2021, the FIA reviewed the regulations again. And this time around, the rule changes created a completely new generation of F1 cars for the 2022 season. The 2022 technical regulations focused primarily on aerodynamics, more specifically, ground effect. This ground effect, which was first introduced by Lotus in 1977, generated large amounts of downforce by creating an area of low pressure beneath the car with a low-riding, contoured floor. This, alongside a redesigned front and rear wing, focused on keeping a car on the road without generating as much turbulent air behind it. This allowed drivers to race closer for longer. However, what really shook things up was the freeze on power unit development. This rule led to the limitation of resources teams could use to upgrade engine components. The budget cap was also lowered from $145 million to $140 million per constructor. This truly shifted the balance of power on the track. Mercedes, previously leading the pack, struggled to navigate the new rules, allowing Red Bull to zoom ahead and claim the spotlight. Well, Red Bull's reign might be coming to an end because of the rules stated for 2026, which will make things completely different. You'll see how. Chapter 4. The 2026 Regulations. The FIA announced the 2026 Power Unit Regulations in 2022 to give the teams an idea of what to work on. Now, the governing body has straightened out the chinks in their regulations and have created a technical roadmap for the sport. With this set of regulations, the FIA has sought to develop a new generation of cars that are fully in touch with the DNA of Formula One. Cars are light, supremely fast and agile, but which also remain at the cutting edge of technology. And to achieve this, we worked towards what we call a nimble car concept. At the center of that vision is a redesigned power unit that features a more even split between the power derived from the internal combustion element and electrical power. On the chassis side, we have managed to reduce the size and weight of the car by 30 kilograms, resulting in a much more dynamic car. In addition, we are introducing 2 exciting new features to enhance racing: active aerodynamics to achieve very low drag on the straights, and the manual override system that will provide drivers with an on-demand burst of battery power when close enough to the car ahead of them. The vision for 2026 is to enhance raceability and close racing. In other words, they've had enough of Red Bull flying ahead while the rest of the grid lags behind. To achieve this, the cars are getting more sustainable power units, and the downforce will be reduced by 30% and drag by 55%. The chassis will be smaller and lighter than the present generation of F1 cars. The maximum floor width will be reduced by 150 millimeters, and the weight reduced by 768 kilograms, 30 kilograms less than today's vehicles. Tire mass will be reduced to 46 kilograms, and the width of the 18-inch wheels will be reduced by 25 millimeters on the front and 30 millimeters on the rear. As for aerodynamics, there will be less reliance on generating downforce through the ground effect because the 2026 F1 cars will have partially flat floors and a less effective diffuser, which will reduce teams' reliance on stiff and low setups. These changes are really huge, and Red Bull might struggle to keep up. That's what the FIA hopes, so the reign of power might be shifted to other teams. However, the FIA's true desire is for several teams to become competitive. We'll see how that turns out. So what do you think? Did you enjoy seeing how teams can afford to splurge on their cars? If you did, then you'll enjoy this next video about drivers, how much they earn, and the significant lifestyle difference between rich and poor drivers. Check the video now. The unbelievable truth about the richest and poorest F1 drivers.